He had learned to live carefully, not because he lacked courage, but because being a single father had taught him that mistakes were expensive. Every decision he made carried weight, measured not just in money or time, but in how it might affect the one person who depended entirely on him. After losing everything he once thought was permanent, he rebuilt his life around one principle: stay out of trouble, stay out of other people's problems, and keep his world small enough to control. Stability, he believed, was the greatest gift he could give his child. The past had taught him that good intentions did not always lead to good outcomes. He had seen how quickly one wrong choice could unravel years of effort, and he refused to let that happen again. So he worked, he provided, and he stayed silent. When life around him demanded involvement, compassion in his mind was a luxury for people who could afford risk. Then one ordinary day disrupted that carefully built distance. It wasn't a dramatic crisis or a moment that demanded immediate heroism. It was a situation he could have ignored completely, one where the law, logic, and common sense all gave him permission to walk away. No one would have blamed him for choosing safety, especially as a single dad already stretched thin. But his child was watching, and for the first time in a long while, he began to wonder whether avoiding responsibility was truly the same as protecting his family. He stood at the edge of a choice that felt uncomfortably familiar, one that asked not what was easiest, but what was right. In that quiet moment before any action was taken, his life began to shift in ways he could not yet see. Life had taught him to move quietly, not because he lacked opinions or values, but because noise attracted consequences, and consequences were expensive when you were raising a child alone. As a single father, he had learned to measure every action against a single question: what happens if this goes wrong? That question guided his choices, shaped his routines, and slowly narrowed the world he allowed himself to engage with. His days followed a predictable rhythm: early mornings, careful budgeting, long hours at work, evenings spent making dinner and listening to his child talk about school. He rarely complained, rarely explained himself to others. Stability had become his language of love. He believed that if he could keep their lives orderly and uneventful, he was doing his job well. The past was something he rarely revisited, not because it lacked meaning, but because it carried too much of it. He had once been more open, more willing to take risks, more confident in his ability to navigate uncertainty. But life had corrected that confidence harshly. Loss had taught him that good intentions did not guarantee good outcomes. And responsibility had taught him that caution was not weakness, it was survival. So when the situation first presented itself, he did exactly what he had trained himself to do. He noticed the problem on a weekday afternoon, in a moment that felt almost insignificant at first. A detail out of place, something that didn't belong. It was the kind of thing most people might ignore without a second thought, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. He recognized immediately that it was not his responsibility, not legally, not practically, not morally, at least not in any way that demanded action. The law was clear, the boundaries were defined. He had every right to stay uninvolved. That clarity should have made the decision easy. Instead, it unsettled him. He told himself that this discomfort was unnecessary, that he was projecting meaning onto a situation that required none. He had a child to think about, responsibilities that did not allow room for distraction. Getting involved would only complicate things, and complication was the enemy of stability. Still, he hesitated longer than he meant to. The people around him offered advice without knowing all the details. Friends, coworkers, even distant relatives echoed the same sentiment in different words. Don't get dragged into someone else's mess. You've got enough on your plate. Focus on your kid. None of them were wrong. Their concern was practical, grounded in experience. They reminded him of everything he stood to lose if he made the wrong choice. He listened, he always did, and in the end, he chose the safest option. He chose to do nothing. At first, nothing seemed to change. Life continued as usual, uninterrupted by drama or confrontation. He returned to his routines with a sense of relief, telling himself that restraint was maturity, that wisdom often looked like restraint. He had avoided unnecessary risk.
He had protected his child from potential fallout. He had done what a responsible parent was supposed to do, or so he believed. The consequences didn't arrive immediately. They never did.
They waited quietly until the decision had settled into something that felt permanent, until the opportunity to act without consequence had passed. When the impact finally reached him, it came indirectly, filtered through observation rather than accusation. His child noticed first. Children had a way of sensing changes adults tried to ignore, not through logic, but through attention, through the small inconsistencies in behavior, the subtle shifts in tone, the questions that lingered unanswered. His child didn't confront him or ask for explanations. Instead, curiosity emerged in quieter ways. Questions about fairness, about helping others, about what people were supposed to do when they saw something wrong. He answered carefully, choosing words that felt safe rather than honest. He spoke about rules, about boundaries, about minding one's own business. He framed caution as wisdom, detachment as responsibility. His child listened, absorbing the explanations without argument. That should have reassured him. Instead, it unsettled him further. The situation he had ignored escalated beyond his control. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines or demanded intervention, but in a way that revealed the cost of inaction. What had once been manageable became complicated. What could have been addressed quietly now carried consequences that affected more people than before. He watched this unfold from a distance, telling himself that involvement now would only make things worse, that stepping in too late was worse than not stepping in at all. These were rationalizations he had used before, and they had always worked until now. The turning point did not come from outside pressure or sudden danger. It came from a moment of reflection he could not avoid. One evening, after his child had gone to bed, he sat alone in the quiet of their small living space. The day had been unremarkable, filled with the same tasks he performed every day. And yet, something felt unresolved. He replayed recent conversations in his mind, especially the ones with his child. The questions, the pauses, the way his explanations had sounded even to himself. For the first time in a long while, he asked himself a different question. Not, what happens if this goes wrong? But what am I teaching my child by choosing safety over integrity? The question unsettled him deeply. He had always believed that being a good father meant shielding his child from risk, from hardship, from the consequences of adult decisions. But he began to realize that protection also carried lessons, that children learn not only from what parents did, but from what they refused to do. By choosing to remain uninvolved, he had modeled avoidance as a virtue. That realization was uncomfortable. Still, discomfort alone was not enough to change his course. He had spent years training himself to endure discomfort without acting on it. It was a skill he had perfected out of necessity. So he continued as before, convincing himself that revisiting the situation would only reopen questions better left unanswered. Then something happened that stripped away his remaining justifications. His child witnessed the consequences of his inaction firsthand. It was not a dramatic scene. No confrontation, no accusation, just an observation, spoken with the simple honesty only a child possessed. A comment that revealed understanding without judgment. "Why didn't anyone help sooner?" his child asked. He froze. The question was not directed at him specifically, but he felt its weight settle squarely on his chest. He struggled to respond, searching for explanations that would not feel like excuses. The words he found were hollow, lacking the certainty he had once relied on. That night, he barely slept. For the first time since becoming a single father, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his definition of responsibility had been incomplete, that by prioritizing safety above all else, he had sacrificed something essential. Not bravery, not kindness, but clarity. He realized that he had been teaching his child how to avoid consequences, not how to choose what was right when consequences were unavoidable. The following days were marked by internal conflict. He revisited the situation repeatedly, examining it from angles he had previously dismissed.
He acknowledged his fear openly, no longer disguising it as practicality. He admitted that his decision had been motivated less by concern for his child and more by his own exhaustion. He was tired of being the one who stepped in, tired of carrying responsibility alone, tired of making decisions that felt heavy regardless of outcome. And yet, that exhaustion did not absolve him of influence. He understood now that his role as a father extended beyond providing shelter and routine. It included modeling values through action, even when action came with risk, especially then. The realization did not come with clarity about what to do next. It came with the uncomfortable understanding that doing nothing was no longer an option. Still, acting now would mean acknowledging his earlier choice as a mistake. It would mean facing potential consequences that could have been avoided had he intervened sooner. It would mean explaining himself to his child in a way that required honesty rather than authority. Those costs felt heavy, but so did the cost of continuing to look away. By the end of the week, he reached a conclusion that frightened him more than any external consequence ever could. If he continued choosing safety at the expense of responsibility, his child would grow up believing that doing the right thing was optional when it was inconvenient. That belief was not one he could accept, and so, with no clear plan and no guarantee of success, he made a decision to revisit the situation he had deliberately avoided, not with the confidence of someone certain they could fix it, but with the humility of someone willing to admit they should have acted sooner. He did not yet know how much this choice would cost him. He only knew that it was no longer possible to pretend that doing nothing was the same as doing right. Once he made the decision to revisit what he had avoided, nothing felt simple anymore. The illusion of control he had built around his life began to fracture. Not all at once, but in slow, uncomfortable pieces. Each day brought reminders that ignoring a problem did not make it disappear. It only allowed it to change shape, often into something far harder to manage. He saw it now with painful clarity, and that clarity came with guilt he could no longer dismiss. He started by retracing his steps mentally at first. He replayed the moment he had chosen to walk away, the reasoning he had used to justify it, the calm that followed. That calm had been temporary, he realized, borrowed time disguised as peace. The cost of that decision was becoming visible, not only in the situation itself, but in how it had altered his sense of integrity. The first real consequence surfaced in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't directed at him. No one accused him or demanded explanations. Instead, the situation worsened quietly, affecting someone who had far less power to absorb the fallout.
What could have been addressed early now required intervention at a level that brought unwanted attention, additional complications, and emotional strain far beyond what was necessary. He watched this unfold from a distance that no longer felt safe, but shameful. Each update felt like an indictment, not because he was solely responsible, but because he knew he had been capable of acting sooner. That knowledge followed him home, sat with him at dinner, and lingered in the pauses between conversations with his child. His child sensed the tension immediately. Children did not need explanations to recognize emotional weight. They noticed it in posture, in silence, in the way adults hesitated before answering simple questions. His child grew quieter, more observant, less eager to fill the space with stories from school. Instead, questions returned, careful ones, framed with curiosity rather than accusation. "Is that thing still happening?" his child asked one evening. He nodded, choosing honesty over dismissal. "Why didn't someone help before it got worse?" The question was gentle, unassuming, but it landed harder than any criticism ever could. He felt his throat tighten, his carefully constructed explanations dissolving under the simplicity of the inquiry. He tried to respond with logic, but the words came out thin, stripped of conviction. "I thought it wasn't our place," he said finally. His child considered this for a long moment. "But someone's place has to be first, right?" the child replied. He had no answer. That night he lay awake replaying the exchange. He realized that his child was not asking him to be a hero. They were asking him to be clear, to show that right and wrong were not abstract concepts reserved for textbooks, but choices made in ordinary moments by ordinary people. He had failed that test. The weight of that realization was heavier than fear had ever been. In the days that followed, his internal conflict deepened. He oscillated between resolve and hesitation, courage and self-doubt. Acting now meant stepping into a situation that had grown more complex, more visible, and more likely to produce consequences he could not fully control. It meant acknowledging that his earlier restraint had been a mistake. For someone who had built his entire identity around being careful, admitting error felt dangerous. He sought advice again, but this time he listened differently. The same voices urged caution, warned against involvement, reminded him of his responsibilities as a single father. Their arguments still made sense, but they no longer felt sufficient. Something fundamental had shifted in how he understood responsibility. Responsibility, he realized, was not only about minimizing risk, it was about owning the influence his choices had on others, especially on the person watching him most closely. The tipping point came not through dramatic escalation, but through quiet inevitability. He received confirmation that the situation would now require official intervention. The matter had crossed thresholds that could no longer be managed informally. Consequences would follow, and they would affect lives in ways that could not be undone easily. He stood in his kitchen, holding the phone long after the call had ended, feeling the weight of inevitability settle around him. This was the outcome he had hoped to avoid by staying uninvolved, and yet by doing nothing, he had allowed exactly this to happen. That night, he spoke to his child openly for the first time. He did not hide behind explanations or authority. He admitted uncertainty, fear, and regret. He told the truth in a way he had rarely allowed himself to do since becoming a parent. "I was scared," he said quietly. "I thought staying out of it would keep us safe, but I think I made it worse." His child listened carefully, not interrupting. "Are you going to try to fix it?" the child asked. The question carried no demand, only expectation. He nodded. "I don't know if I can fix it," he said, "but I can try to do the right thing now." That was enough. The next day, he took his first concrete step. It was not dramatic or heroic. It involved paperwork, phone calls, and uncomfortable conversations. He introduced himself where he had previously remained anonymous. He asked questions he had avoided asking. He offered cooperation without guarantees, knowing full well that his involvement might expose him to inconvenience, scrutiny, or even blame. Each step felt heavy. He encountered resistance almost immediately. People questioned his motives, his timing, his authority to intervene. Some were polite, others dismissive. A few were openly skeptical, pointing out that his involvement now complicated matters rather than simplified them. They weren't entirely wrong. At one point, he nearly retreated again. The familiar instinct to withdraw resurfaced, fueled by exhaustion and self-doubt. He reminded himself that he had already delayed action once and that retreating now would only confirm the lesson he was trying to undo. So he stayed. The process was slower and messier than he had anticipated. Progress came in fragments, often offset by setbacks that tested his resolve. There were moments when he questioned whether stepping in had truly been the right choice, especially when consequences affected his schedule, finances, and emotional availability at home. His child noticed these changes too. They saw him come home tired, frustrated, sometimes discouraged, but they also saw something new: determination that did not harden into bitterness, a willingness to persist even when results were uncertain. He spoke openly about what he was doing and why, framing the experience not as a burden but as a responsibility he had chosen. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he sat with his child at the table, sorting through documents while explaining what they meant in simple terms. His child listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed growing understanding rather than confusion. "You're helping because it's the right thing, even though it's hard," the child said. He nodded. "That's what being responsible really is," he replied, surprised by his own certainty. Over time, small changes became visible. Not solutions, not resolutions, but movement. The situation stabilized enough to prevent further harm. Those affected gained access to support that had previously been out of reach. The path forward remained complicated, but it was no longer spiraling unchecked. He did not receive praise for his involvement.
In some cases, he received criticism. Others viewed his actions as too little, too late. He accepted these reactions without defensiveness, understanding that accountability included accepting how his choices were perceived. What mattered most to him was what his child was learning. He noticed subtle shifts in their behavior, increased confidence in expressing opinions, a growing willingness to speak up when something felt unfair, questions that reflected moral reasoning rather than passive acceptance. One afternoon, his child recounted a situation at school where a classmate had been treated unfairly. Instead of remaining silent, the child had spoken to a teacher, even though it made them nervous.
I remembered what you said, the child explained, that sometimes you have to do the hard thing. He felt something loosen in his chest. That moment did not erase his earlier mistake, but it gave meaning to his effort to correct it. He realized that modeling accountability mattered as much as modeling courage. Showing his child that adults could admit error and change course was a lesson he had not known how to teach until now. As weeks passed, the situation reached a point where his role became less central. Systems took over. Processes continued without his constant involvement. The crisis phase ended, replaced by long-term management that no longer required his daily attention. He felt relief, but also reflection. He understood now that stepping in had not solved everything. It had not restored simplicity to his life or eliminated risk, but it had restored something else, alignment between his values and his actions. That alignment mattered more than comfort. Looking back, he recognized how easily fear had disguised itself as responsibility, how often he had equated caution with wisdom, avoidance with care. He no longer believed that protecting his child meant insulating them from every difficulty. Protection, he now understood, also meant teaching how to face difficulty with integrity. The experience left him changed in ways that extended beyond the specific situation. He became more attentive to moments where silence felt easier than action, more aware of the lessons his choices communicated, even when he said nothing. He did not seek out problems or involve himself unnecessarily, but he no longer automatically retreated from discomfort. He allowed himself to assess situations with a broader lens, one that considered not only immediate risk but long-term influence. Most importantly, he carried forward a new understanding of fatherhood. Being a single dad did not mean eliminating uncertainty from his child's life. It meant navigating uncertainty honestly, visibly, and with intention. It meant showing that fear was not something to be obeyed, but something to be acknowledged and weighed against values. As the chapter closed on the situation that had first challenged him, he knew it would not be the last time he faced such choices. Life rarely offered clear lines between right and wrong, safe and dangerous. What it offered instead were moments of decision, often quiet, often inconvenient, where character was shaped incrementally. He was still learning. But now he was learning openly, and his child was learning with him. By the time the situation no longer required his daily involvement, he realized something unexpected. He missed it, not the stress, not the uncertainty, not the exhaustion that had come with stepping into responsibility late. What he missed was the clarity, the sense that his actions, however imperfect, were aligned with something he could stand behind. For years, his life had been defined by avoidance disguised as prudence. Now, even in the aftermath of difficulty, he felt more grounded than he had in a long time. That feeling did not erase the cost. There were tangible consequences to what he had done. Missed work hours that affected his income, strained relationships with people who believed he had overstepped, moments when his patience ran thin and guilt resurfaced, reminding him that stepping in late still meant others had suffered unnecessarily. He did not escape judgment, either external or internal, but he accepted it. For the first time, he did not measure his worth by how little trouble he caused, but by how willing he was to carry the weight of his decisions. The final phase of involvement demanded something different from him. It was no longer about preventing further harm. It was about repair, slow, unglamorous, and often invisible. He helped where he could, followed through on commitments, and resisted the urge to control outcomes.
He learned to support without dominating, to assist without assuming authority he did not have. This restraint was harder than avoidance had ever been. Letting go of control meant trusting processes, people, and time. It meant accepting that not every problem could be resolved neatly and that some consequences would linger regardless of effort. He struggled with this, especially when impatience whispered that more action might lead to faster results. But he held back. He had learned that responsibility was not about doing everything, it was about doing what was necessary, then allowing space for others to take over. At home, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. His child no longer watched him with quiet uncertainty. Instead, there was a new attentiveness, a curiosity grounded in respect rather than dependence. Conversations shifted. They spoke not only about what had happened, but about how it felt, about fear, about doubt, about making choices without knowing the outcome. He did not present himself as someone who always knew the right answer. He presented himself as someone who was learning. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, his child asked a question that reflected that shift. "Do you think grown-ups are still figuring things out?" He smiled, recognizing the significance of the question. "All the time," he replied. "The difference is whether we pretend we aren't." That honesty felt like progress. As weeks turned into months, the experience reshaped how he moved through the world. He became more attentive to moments where silence felt comfortable but wrong. He noticed opportunities to intervene early, gently, before situations escalated into crises. Not because he sought responsibility, but because he no longer feared it reflexively. He remained cautious. Being a single father still required balance. He did not rush into every problem or volunteer for causes that would compromise his ability to care for his child. But he stopped equating restraint with virtue automatically. He allowed values to weigh in alongside risk. This shift did not go unnoticed. People around him began to respond differently, some with appreciation, others with skepticism. A few quietly adjusted their own behavior, influenced not by his words but by his consistency. He did not announce his principles or demand recognition. He simply acted when action was required and stepped back when it was not. The most significant change, however, occurred within his relationship with his child. His child grew more confident in expressing opinions, even when they disagreed. They questioned rules, not to challenge authority, but to understand reasoning. They showed greater empathy toward others, recognizing complexity rather than defaulting to blame. One afternoon, his child came home upset about a situation at school. A peer had been blamed for something they did not do, and most of the class had accepted the explanation without question. His child struggled with whether to speak up. "I didn't want to make it worse," the child admitted. He listened carefully, resisting the urge to provide immediate guidance. Instead, he asked what his child thought was right. "I think staying quiet made it worse," the child said finally. He nodded. "Then you already know what matters," he replied. That moment confirmed what he had come to understand. Lessons lived were stronger than lessons taught. The experience also forced him to re-examine how he viewed himself. For years, he had defined his identity narrowly, as a provider, a protector, someone who minimized risk. Those roles were important but incomplete. He now recognized himself as a moral influence, someone whose choices shape not only outcomes but perspectives. This realization was both empowering and sobering. It meant that opting out was itself a choice, that neutrality was not neutral, that silence carried messages whether intended or not. He did not relish this responsibility, but he accepted it as part of parenthood. As time passed, the situation that had first challenged him faded into memory, referenced occasionally, but no longer central to daily life. What remained was its imprint, a recalibration of how he engaged with the world. He did not become fearless. Fear remained a constant companion, especially when stakes were high, but it no longer dictated his decisions unchallenged. He learned to acknowledge fear without surrendering to it,
to consider it alongside values rather than above them. One evening, reflecting quietly after his child had gone to sleep, he thought about how close he had come to reinforcing a lesson he would have regretted, how easily he might have taught his child that safety was the highest good, regardless of cost. He was grateful for the discomfort that had interrupted that trajectory. Grateful, too, for the humility the experience had forced upon him. He no longer saw mistakes as failures to be hidden, but as opportunities to demonstrate accountability. Admitting error had not weakened his authority as a parent, it had strengthened trust. In the broader sense, his life did not change dramatically. There were no promotions, no public recognition, no clear markers of success. His routines remained largely the same. He still woke early, worked hard, and managed responsibilities carefully. But the internal experience of those routines had shifted. They felt chosen rather than imposed. He understood now that being a single dad was not about eliminating uncertainty. It was about modeling how to navigate it, about showing that care and courage were not opposites, but partners, about demonstrating that doing the right thing was often inconvenient, uncomfortable, and incomplete, and still worth doing. The final confirmation of that lesson came unexpectedly. Months later, his child participated in a school project focused on community and responsibility. When asked to share an example of someone who had made a difficult choice, his child spoke about him, not with exaggeration or idealization, but with honesty. They didn't know if it would work, his child explained, but they tried anyway because it was the right thing. Hearing those words later, he felt a quiet sense of resolution, not pride, alignment. He had not been perfect. He had not acted quickly. He had not avoided all harm, but he had corrected course openly and visibly. And in doing so, he had given his child something more valuable than certainty. He had given them a framework for choosing. As he looked ahead, he knew more challenges would come, more moments where the line between safety and responsibility blurred. He did not expect those decisions to become easier. But he trusted himself now in a way he hadn't before, not because he believed he would always choose correctly, but because he believed he would choose consciously. That belief was enough. And so, without fanfare or finality, his journey through that difficult chapter came to a close. Not with resolution, but with readiness. Not with answers, but with a deeper commitment to the questions that mattered. He remained a single dad, navigating an imperfect world with limited resources and ongoing responsibility. But he was no longer hiding behind caution. He was standing imperfectly but deliberately, in alignment with the values he hoped his child would one day call their own. In the end, nothing about his life became perfect. The risks did not disappear, and the world did not suddenly become kinder. But something far more important changed. He stopped letting fear make his choices for him. As a single father, he learned that protecting a child does not mean avoiding every difficult moment. It means standing in those moments with honesty, even when the outcome is uncertain. It means showing that doing the right thing is not about being fearless, but about acting despite fear. His child did not see a flawless parent. They saw someone who made a mistake, admitted it, and chose to do better. And that lesson will last longer than any comfort safety could ever provide. Because in a world that often rewards silence, the quiet courage to step forward is sometimes the greatest inheritance a parent can give. And that is how real change begins, not with certainty, but with the decision to try anyway.